The following story is told from the point of view of a female. When I was about 7 years old, I was at a friend's birthday party. We went to the local cinema with a group of 6 other kids, my friend and her mother. I had to use the bathroom during the movie, and I told her mom, assuming that she would come with me, because even then I knew going to places alone as a kid could be dangerous, but she didn't go with me. I went out to the bathroom alone. I must mention that it was a small local cinema which was really old, and most of the time it was empty. It wasn't like regular theaters nowadays that always have people bustling about. Anyway, on my way to the bathroom, I saw some guy leaning against the concession counter, seemingly with nothing to do. I thought maybe he was waiting for his kids to come out of the restroom or something. At this place, the bathroom was one small room that was divided into 2 halves. On one side was 2 stalls for men, on the other 2 stalls for women. I entered the bathroom and sat down to do my business. The guy came in about a minute after me. I could see his shadow under the door of the stall that I was in. He was walking back and forth outside of it. He shouldn't have been over on the women's side, and no one else was in the restroom with us, so I began to panic. I stayed in there for a couple of minutes because I was too scared to go out. He eventually left, and I decided to go back. When I walked out of the bathroom, he was standing there blocking the doorway, standing with his arms and legs spread out like he was ready to grab me and scoop me up. My heart started racing. He was more than twice my size, and I was terrified. I thought fast enough to jump through the gap between his legs. I skittered on the carpet and burned my knees, but I got up as fast as I could and ran back to the theater that my party was in. I wish it had ended there. That night at home, I remember hiding this doll that I had because I thought the man was going to come for me, and I wanted to make sure my doll was safe. My mom noticed me acting weird and asked me what was wrong. I blurted out that a man had tried to grab me when I was at the cinema. She kind of brushed it off, but I think that she was trying to act like nothing was wrong for my sake. I could see in her eyes that she was worried. Later, I heard her and my dad talking, and she asked me what the guy looked like. Did he have a black mustache? Did he have messy hair? He did. But how did she know these things? It turns out he was at our fucking house earlier that day, replacing a window, and he must have overheard me and my mom talking about the party. I don't know what he was planning on doing if he grabbed me. Was he going to kidnap me, or something else? I'm just glad he didn't succeed. I brought all of this up to my mom last night. She looked surprised for a moment, like she didn't think that I would even remember the incident after all this time. But how could I forget? She seemed uneasy talking about it, but I eventually got it out of her that the guy was never caught. I'll admit, when she said this, I had a moment of this sinking feeling in my chest. They never saw or heard from him again. She told me that the police had assumed that he had skipped town after failing to kidnap me out of fear of being identified. I can't help but feel worried though. Worried that he may have caught another kid, that they may not have been as lucky as I was. I really hope this piece of shit was scared out of attempting this again, and no kids were harmed. I once asked my great-uncle what his absolute worst memory was from his youth. He didn't hesitate at all when he told me that it was the night he went to go see the movie Dirty Harry, starring Clint Eastwood. It was 1971. It was at a small theater in Wyoming. My great-uncle and his best friend had bought tickets for $1.50 each to get in to see the movie. The cinema had a single screen, and they were sitting in the very back row because they intended to smoke cigarettes and didn't want to be caught and thrown out. He recalled there being only about 4 or 5 other people in the theater. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the flick, Clint Eastwood played a loose cannon cop who was borderline insane and was on the hunt for a serial killer who called himself Scorpio. The plot was heavily inspired by the real-life Zodiac Killer, and it was mainly that reason the two of them had skipped school to check the movie out. My uncle was big into true crime and unsolved mysteries. He told me that as he was watching the movie, he was being distracted by what smelt like spoiled meat. Even the cigarettes didn't help hide the scent. Once the movie was over, his friend immediately wanted to leave and escape the putrid smell. But my uncle bent down and started looking underneath the seats out of curiosity. 2 rows ahead of him, he noticed what appeared to be a meat patty laying forgotten, and he made his way over to it, confused about how it had been overlooked by the staff. When he reached the correct aisle and bent down, he then shot up again, just as quickly, and started freaking out and cursing in shock. What he had originally believed to be a harmless piece of hamburger meat was in fact an actual severed hand. It was a left hand, with soggy gray flesh, sitting in a thick stain of blood, and a handful of flies were buzzing around it. What was worse is that 3 of the fingers were detached and scattered across the floor not far away. My uncle told me that there was only one employee there at the time. He was a very overweight attendant who was sitting up front smoking a cigar, and the man didn't believe him at all, until he actually brought one of the fingers over wrapped up in his handkerchief. When the attendant saw the finger, he grabbed it and headed over to the theater with a dustpan and broom, looking more annoyed than alarmed. Another one of the theater patrons noticed what was going on and went across the street to call the police. My uncle's friend didn't want to wait for the police to arrive and instead got on his bike and rode home. My uncle stayed and watched as the police questioned the attendant and the man who made the call. The attendant denied everything, even after my uncle spoke up and told them where he had found the hand. The police went inside the theater and apparently saw enough blood on the floor that they took the attendant in for questioning. But they never actually interviewed my uncle properly. He ended up just riding on his bike home, practically being ignored and forgotten by all the adults in the room. He never found out the exact story behind the severed hand, but he suspected the attendant and the other members of the staff may have tortured someone in there after hours, cutting off their fingers first before moving on to their entire hand. The theater was shut down several months later and eventually condemned. I asked my uncle why this was his worst memory and not his most exciting, and he simply replied, "Because whoever owned that hand was very likely murdered, and the killers will never be brought to justice." He says he can still remember the smell of the rotting flesh and the sound of buzzing flies circling around it. So back in the early 90s, there used to be this tiny drive-in movie theater in eastern Missouri, along that narrow stretch of borderline with Kentucky. I would go there often with my 2 older brothers and younger sister during the weekends. We had this flatbed trailer that we would hitch up to our dad's truck, and we would set up our folding chairs and a cooler of beer and watch the movie from our mobile platform. Most of the time, we didn't really care what was playing. It was just fun to get out of the house and have an excuse to drink. I remember this night fairly well because my brother had chipped a tooth the day before and had an ice pack to his jaw. I don't recall the name of the movie we were watching. I think it was some cop movie or something. I had my Empire Strikes Back t-shirt on for some reason, and I remember being barefoot. This was one of the first screenings of the summer, and there were only 2 other cars in the lot. My brothers were arguing over something, and my sister and I were sharing the cassette player and headphones, passing it back and forth between songs. We were all smoking and drinking, and only half paying attention to the movie, when we heard someone yelling from the trees to our left. My brother raised his flashlight to scan the tree line, and after a few seconds, an Asian girl, maybe 18 to 20 years old, came limping out of the shadows. She was completely naked, except for a plastic bag around her waist, and there was a long nylon cord around one of her ankles. All 4 of us immediately jumped off the flatbed and made our way over to her. She was crying and gasping for air, and she collapsed to her knees. By the light of my brother's flashlight, we saw that she was bleeding from a gouge behind her right earlobe and had several bruises along her arms, face, and knees. My older brother took off his windbreaker and put it around her. We all began talking at once. I was suggesting that we carry her to the truck while my brothers were trying to talk to her, asking her where she had come from and what happened. My sister handed her a bottle of water and was trying to talk above everyone else loudly proclaiming someone needed to go find a phone and call the cops. I noticed another one of the driving customers get out of his car to get a look at what was happening, and the owner of the lot was also making his way over to us from the entrance. The Asian girl continued to hyperventilate and sob, and kept glancing back behind her into the woods. As far as I remember, she hadn't said anything, until that moment when she called out, "Run!" She tried to leap to her feet, but staggered and collapsed into my brother's arms. I glanced up and pointed towards the trees, snapping at all my siblings to shut up. I noticed 3 figures wearing burlap sacks over their heads, carefully stepping out of the tree line. Until that moment, none of us had made note of exactly how long the cord was that the girl was dragging behind her. One of the men in the burlap sacks took a few careful steps forward until he was about 10 yards away. He slowly placed his foot down on the end of the line. The frantic girl started screaming. My sister and I were cursing at the masked men, and one of my brothers picked up a rock and told him to back off away from the cord. None of the men moved. I remember scanning all of them for any signs of a weapon, but they didn't appear to have any, at least nothing large and obvious. They were still mostly in the shadows, and the only way that I could really see them was the glare of the movie screen and the wandering beam of my brother's flashlight. As I type this out, I understand how ludicrous this must sound, and thinking back on it now, I constantly remind myself that it wasn't a dream, and I was on the front lines of a terrifying standoff that nearly resulted in bloodshed. The owner of the drive-in finally reached us, and immediately raised a sawn-off shotgun directly at the face of the closest masked man, and told him to get the fuck off his property. From behind us, I heard the sounds of tires rolling across gravel, and glanced back towards the entrance to see 2 pickup trucks pull up, their headlights pointing right at our group. And for a split second I thought they were there to help us, until I noticed the deer skulls mounted on their hoods. The trucks just sat there, idling, as silent as the 3 masked men in front of us. The owner didn't turn around, and didn't even flinch. He called out again that if they didn't get the fuck off his property, no matter what the guys in the trucks did, he was going to shoot the 3 of them at least. The brother not holding the rock had frantically been working with his bare fingers at the knot of the cord around the girl's ankles, but to no avail. And the lingering silence that followed, it was right then when the thought first crossed my mind that we might all die right here. After another few moments, the masked man removed his foot from the cord and took several steps back. His friends followed suit. Without turning their backs on us, they disappeared into the shadows like unblinking phantoms. And once they were gone, the 2 pickup trucks spun out loudly on the gravel and took off down the road. The police arrived shortly after with an ambulance for the girl. A few officers combed the woods, but they didn't find anything the masked men had left behind. It turned out that the girl did not speak much English, and she claimed that her name was Hildegard, but that always felt made up to me. A week or so later, a man's body was found in those very same woods by hunters. He had been beaten to death. It may have just been a coincidence, but I think it was one of the burlap sack men whose friends had turned on him. After that night, we never saw or heard from the Asian girl again, though we inquired at the police station and hospital about her several times. I know that a few different TV news vans showed up at the drive-in, but the owner refused to give an interview and chased them off his property. Regardless of the event being reported and televised, the word got around, and the drive-in officially closed in 1992. The 4 of us were there at the last screening, before it was closed for good. The entire last week, the drive-in was playing Batman Returns, and we saw it 3 times. My eyes were rarely on the screen though. More often than not, I was glancing over to the spot where the girl had emerged from the woods. I was always nervous that a masked figure might be standing there, staring back at me.
There's always a reason to be afraid.